Ms. Janet Sands is a California native with a degree in art history from UC Berkeley. One of the many things that I admire about Janet is that she is a lifelong student of history, art, and the natural world. She's also a collector of American regional art. She's called many places home, including LA, the Bay Area, Paris, New York, Connecticut, Santa Barbara, and currently Flagstaff, near the Grand Canyon, her favorite natural wonder. Janet and her husband Ed, an architect, history buff, and ship model builder, split their time between Arizona and New York to be near their children and grandchildren. Ed, in the back, was our former president of our board of trustees. Janet is a longtime board... Send money, Ed. Janet is a longtime board member of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and also the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State. She is the former president of one of my favorite history clubs, the Santa Barbara Chorale of Westerners. And I might add that she is currently working on her second book, which I'm sure she'll be back to tell us about, called The Collision of Cultures, a Southwest History for Travelers. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend Janet Sands.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really thrilled to see you all. Thanks to all my old friends and new friends, and thanks to the students. How's this? Now, if you can't, I'm a lot shorter than Daisha, and I did not wear heels tonight. So anyway, and I have this cool thing going on, so let me know if it stops working. My iPhone is my remote. Watch this. Whoop. Pretty cool, huh? Okay. All right. So anyway, I want to especially thank Daisha, Emily, Jeannie, the entire staff of this wonderful museum. You just do a fabulous job here. We have a long history with this place, and we just love you all. And by the way, I really want to welcome the students from UCSB. I was so excited when I heard that history students were coming that I actually went back. Yay. I went back and rewrote part of my talk to make sure and put some stuff in there I thought you'd like. Okay. So, of course, I always start out my talks with a few horse-themed pictures because we're horse people, and I know there are horse people in this room right now. Here we have Hope Ranch with us in our nerdy Christmas outfits. We have with the Santa Ynez Valley Hounds and with the Santa Barbara Sage Hens. Now, for many of us, horses are one of the best loved aspects of Hispanic history in California. It's, especially here on the Central Coast where the vaquero tradition is very, very much alive today. That left-hand picture was taken just a few years ago up at Rancho La Purísima near Buellton. And of course, Santa Barbara's Fiesta Parade is the largest equestrian parade with over 600 horses in the United States. And I believe we have one or two people here this evening who ride in it every year, and you know who you are. Okay. Now, to begin with, we're going to do a couple of real quick composite slides so you can see all the missions as they appear today. All right, these images just remind us, as do the beautiful Deacon paintings in the gallery, and I encourage you to see them multiple times, that these missions are just wonderful historic places to visit, and that the mission era's architectural and cultural legacy is just a major part of California's identity. All but 3 of them today are active parish churches and the centers of their community. And by the way, if you're curious which ones are not, it's La Purísima, Santa Cruz, and San Francisco de Solana up in Sonoma. They are all part of state historic parks. So, that said, sometimes it's kind of hard to think about history. It can be uncomfortable, Parts of the past just don't make us feel very good. But I'd like to propose that context is really important, as is being open to different perspectives. One of my favorite cartoons. Okay. I hope the Admiral appreciates this. I think there's an Admiral in the room. Okay. So now, our perspective here in the 21st century, last time I checked, is certainly different to someone living in, say, the 16th, 17th, or 18th century. And the indigenous perspective is important. Now, I cannot even remotely pretend to represent that. But because Ed and I now live in northern Arizona, which is Indian country, we've noticed that, as with all groups of people on this planet, groups are not monolithic, and the indigenous perspective is a lot more varied than you might think. And I want to tell you a quick little story that I just think is wonderful. Last summer, here, by the way, Monument Valley is on the Big Res. That's the 27,000 square mile Navajo reservation, the largest Indian reservation in the country. So last summer, I was chatting with Brian So, the Navajo stonemason who was doing some work for us, but building stone pillars on our deck. And I found out he was studying to be a hatali. That's, well, you might call it a medicine man or singer, someone who conducts ceremonies in their culture. And he told me about that for a minute, and then he asked what I was doing. And I said, well, I kind of got into history writing. Well, Brian just relaxed and reflected for a moment, as hatalis do. And then he said something I will never forget. Out of nowhere, he said, there is a beauty to history. History is transportation. It's what gets us from point A to point B. And then he said, without history, you and I would not be standing here having this conversation. And I said, Brian, may I go inside and write that down? He said, yes, I could. And I said, I'm going to quote you on that. Do you mind? He said, no, not at all. So his emphasis on transportation was revealing. He's certainly in touch with the deep past, with his people's origin stories. So now let's us look at the prequel to the California story. A different type of hatali, Father Maynard Geiger, who was for a long time the archivist at Mission Santa Barbara, he wrote a book about the Indians of Mission Santa Barbara, and in it he said, it must not be forgotten that the true and original pioneers of this land were the Indians from whatever regions they came. Well, since he wrote that back in 1960, we've learned quite a lot about the origins of California's native people. So what was it like here before Spaniards arrived? So California's north-south orientation and unsettled geology, as we all know, have created an incredible variety of terrain, climate zones, and ecosystems. This resulted in one of the most linguistically diverse indigenous populations on Earth. So, here is a map of California's pre-contact tribal groups and language families. About 325,000 people were living here, what we call pre-contact, in roughly 80, I think it's 78, tribal groups, with perhaps 1,000 distinct and localized triblets, speaking hundreds of mutually unintelligible languages. And by the way, fiercely defending their turf from one another. Now, it takes, as linguists will tell you, it takes a really long time for that kind of language diversity to evolve. So when did the first Americans arrive? Where did they come from? And how did they get here? As to where, the 16th century Jesuit naturalist Jose de Acosta first proposed what, just from looking at Native Americans, what genomics has now confirmed, all Native American ancestors came from Asia. They also carried some European genes with them across the Asian continent, because remember, we're all originally from Africa. Well, when and how, those are the hot topics. This is the Blackwater Draw site where the Clovis points were first discovered. Before DNA evidence was a possibility, archaeological evidence like the beautiful fluted spear points that were first found at Clovis, New Mexico in the 1920s, and then at sites throughout North America, supported a widely held, a once widely accepted Clovis first hypothesis, which was that the first Americans were big game hunters who migrated from Siberia over a land bridge that's now under the Bering Sea, and then through the ice-free corridors that opened up between the retreating glaciers about 12,000 years ago. It's now clear that was a route, but probably not for the first Americans. Since the this is why you got to be careful whenever you hear the words settled science. Just be real careful about that one, okay? It's kind of dangerous. Since the 1920s and 30s, many coastal and other sites have been discovered throughout the Americas that predate the opening of the ice-free corridor. In other words, humans had migrated from Asia when 1 to 2 mile thick glaciers covered most of the northern hemisphere. What's more, it likely took more than 1,000 years after the ice melted for that ice-free corridor to become repopulated with, say, life, the plants and animals people would have needed on what would have been a very long, cold walk. Well, today, we're quite sure that the earliest Americans didn't have to walk. Early mariners likely traveled here from Asia by sea, following what one team of scientists called the Kelp Highway. That was first published in 2007, and at the time it was, I won't say it was ridiculed, but it was greeted with a great deal of skepticism. Well, today, we're pretty sure there's a lot of evidence to support that theory. The kelp forest ecosystem was and is virtually the same from Japan all the way around the northern Pacific and down the coasts of the Americas. And further, it was rich in the type of resources, that's what archaeologists call food and stuff, that those early mariners would have needed. And by the way, this kelp ecosystem goes all the way down to southern Chile, where one of the oldest sites in the Americas was found. And that was at Monteverde, Chile, and that was dated to 14,500 years ago. So I love this, by the way, and Carl, I hope you don't mind. I had stolen a video from the Museum of Natural History, but I can't make it work from my remote. Anyway, imagine the fish swimming around. Now, there's the tomole anyway. And according to the preeminent archaeologist, Curtis Marion, the Chumash were the most advanced coastal hunter-gatherers in the world. Now, doesn't it make sense that their ancestors were expert ancient mariners who could have accomplished that feat? Well, the kelp, I gotta say there's a news flash. I promised some new things for people who've attended my talks before. That Kelp Highway team has not been sitting on their hands. They've been out there analyzing glacial and sea ice in the North Pacific, and they have found that early people could have traveled along the coast even during what's called the last glacial maximum, i.e. in the depths of the last ice age, because there was so much sea ice that in winter it kind of melded together to create a seasonal sea ice highway. You can Google that, by the way. It's the same people who came up with the Kelp Highway hypothesis, John Erlandson and his team. So just go Google sea ice highway. It's pretty fascinating how they analyzed ice to figure out where the ice used to be 10 or 20,000 years ago. Dog lovers, please note. The first Americans did bring their dogs with them because horses hadn't been domesticated yet. Now, here's another archaeological bombshell that landed during COVID. I don't know if you read about the White Sands footprints. In 2021, scientists published their discovery of human footprints found along the edge of an ancient lake, Paleo Lake in the parlance, that is now buried under the dunes in White Sands National Monument. To find out how old the footprints were, they were fossilized. The team radiocarbon dated seeds of aquatic plants that were embedded in the same undisturbed layer with the fossilized footprints. Now, they came up with really old dates, which of course were challenged, and so the team have since retested the trackway with 2 other high-tech dating methods, which I won't go into in detail right now, but if the students want to know, I'll tell you, and came up with the same dates. Remember that earlier date I mentioned, Monteverde, Chile was 14,500 years ago? They dated those footprints to 21 to 23,000 years ago. That was a wow, okay. Now, we do know there were multiple waves of migration into the Americas by land and by sea during the thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Now, remember that my emphasis was on perspective. So keep in mind, and by the way, I know that the colonial era can cause a lot of anxiety. Well, here's something for you. We know that migration and movement is what humans do and have always done, ever since first leaving our common homeland in Africa, beginning about 70,000 years ago. By the way, I always call Curtis Marion to check my dates because they change all the time and he knows. So I say, Curtis, is it still 70? Yeah, about that. So small and large groups of people and entire populations have migrated, explored, traded with, conquered, been conquered by, colonized, enslaved, mixed with, that means intermarried, and replaced other peoples and populations. It's as the author of this book, David Reich, who's a Harvard geneticist who's taken it upon himself to sequence the genomes of all human populations, living and past, as he has said, it's hard to think about the numberless violent confrontations that have taken place and the human suffering that happened during that whole process. But there was also survival, discovery, cooperation, cultural blending, and extraordinary human achievement. Now, if this topic interests you, you might check out David Reich's book and also this one that Ed and I just read. I'm married to a history nerd, by the way. Empires of the Steppes. We're talking 5,000 years of that sort of thing going on over in Eurasia. It's pretty amazing stuff. Now, the missions and presidios, like all European settlements in the Americas, represent this entire process. I find this topic so interesting that it's the title of a book I'm working on now that's going to be called Collision of Cultures, and it'll be something like Missions, Pueblos, and Ancient Peoples of the Southwest. It's not a quick project. I think I'm going to finish it someday, though. It's about half done. So here's a question. History is about asking questions. It's a lot like science that way. You ask a question, then you go and start doing research. And I wish I had my slide of Alice going down the rabbit hole that turns into a mine shaft. Anyway, so a California archaeologist and state park ranger, Mark Hilkema, wrote once, "The Spanish period is a nexus. In California, prehistory and history come together in a historical instant." So we've glimpsed the story of the first Californians. Now let's look at the people who were on the other side of that instant at first contact. Did you ever wonder why Spain? I mean, why wasn't it China? By the way, in the early 1400s, China had the maritime technology to get across the Pacific, undoubtedly, but they just decided they didn't want to. They just turned their back on that whole project. Some new guys came in power, the regime changed. They burned their ships, burned all the logs and charts, and said, hey, we're just going to rebuild that Great Wall. So it wasn't China. Why Spain? What was it about their history and culture that put Spaniards, actually Castilians, in the advance guard for reuniting the new world with the old? Well, as per usual in most human endeavors, you can follow the money, because it was all about trade. Ever since early humans began walking huge distances to get the best stone and chert and obsidian for their spear points, humans have just wanted to get the good stuff. Okay. It's just one author called trade the oldest impulse behind human movement. I would say it's the second oldest human impulse, period, and you all can figure out what the first one was. Now, for Europeans, ever since the Greeks and Romans and way before, it was always about getting to the luxury goods of the Far East, of China, India, the Spice Islands. Remember, Western Europe, until the age of so-called exploration, it was a backwater for most of history. All the good stuff came from China and India and back east. That 6th century Byzantine Empress Theodora and her retinue dressed in fabulous, they should be in the exhibit right now, fabulous silk gowns. And there was also, during the imperial Rome, insane demand for pepper, which was worth almost as much as silk. It's on everybody's table now. It wasn't common then. And in the Americas, I mean, people had established trading networks for thousands of years, all over the continents. This map of the major prehistoric trading networks in the North Americas looks like a modern highway system. Remember, they were walking. They did not have horses or any kind of beasts of burden. Maybe their dogs carried some stuff. For centuries, oops, come on, there you go. Well, let's go back. For centuries, fabulous things traveled east and west on the Silk Roads across Asia and on maritime routes along the Asian coastlines and through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, which is obviously still an issue today. But in 1453, the Ottoman Empire defeated the remnants of the fading Byzantine Empire at the Siege of Constantinople and closed the Silk routes to Christians. At the time, Spain was busy ending the Reconquista, the misnamed Reconquista, an on-again, off-again 700-year struggle to retake the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors. Those were Islamic Arabs and the Moors of Berber descent, who had themselves taken it from the Visigoths in the 8th century. The last battle of the Reconquista was in January of 1492. That's kind of a familiar date, when the forces of Castile and Aragon under Isabel and Ferdinand, they defeated the last Islamic sultanate at Granada, which is at Spain's southern edge. Now remember our question, why Spain? Well, the conquistador class arose during the Reconquista. These were warriors who self-financed their military campaigns and counted on having their investment repaid with land, labor, and the right to exact tribute or tax if they succeeded. It's sort of like today's Silicon Valley VCs doing leverage buyouts, right? That's where you buy a company with its own assets, right, guys and gals? So, when I first heard that, I thought, that can't happen, right? No, it does. This allowed the Iberian monarchs to wage war on a royal shoestring in the name of defending and spreading the Catholic faith. The Reconquista imbued them with a dual mandate, which they carried with them into the New World. It was famously summed up by the great conquistador Hernan Cortez, quote, "We came to serve God and to get rich, as all men desire to do," unquote. The Catholic monarchs were serious about the holy mission part. One tragic result, of course, was the infamous Inquisition, which drove all the Moors and the Jews from Spain. Now, this matters to California, but not yet, so hang on. So, at the end of the Reconquista, Portugal, Spain's Iberian neighbor, had already reconquered its territory 200 years earlier. And of course, facing the Atlantic, Portugal was a maritime nation, and they were really involved in trade, and they were really affected by the closure of the Silk routes across Asia. So while Spain was busy ending the Reconquista, Portugal was busy doing a workaround. So, and by the way, Portugal was like a frenemy to Spain. I mean, they were related, but they were friends, but they fought each other at times. That's a whole long story in itself. Prince Henry the Navigator, and that was a name given to him by some 19th century German historians, by the way. He made his villa at the port of Zagros a Silicon Valley type hotbed of innovation, where advances in navigation and ship technology were developed for his drive to find a sea route around Africa and to China and India. Some historians have compared that with the US space program. The technology in ships had to be changed a lot for them to do that kind of oceanic voyage. So by 1488, Diaz had rounded the southern tip of Africa, and 10 years later, Gama reached India. For a time, the Indian Ocean, the sea route to China, became a fiercely defended Portuguese lake, which is why if you get stung by one of those guys, it's called a Portuguese man-of-war. So like true VCs themselves, Ferdinand and Isabella, I like to call them Ferdinand and Isabella Inc., took a chance on a persistent Genovese navigator with big ideas, his Portuguese father-in-law's maps, charts, and logs, and instruments, and his connections to the Genovese, remember he was from Genoa, the Genovese banking cabal in Seville. And as you know, they took a chance on him, and their modest bet on Columbus paid off. No, she did not hawk her jewels. They didn't invest much in Columbus. Oh, there they are. I forgot to change and show you the Ferdinand and Isabella Inc. And let's go to, I was so busy. So what happened? was after the Portuguese made it around Africa, the Pope drew a line of demarcation that was actually horizontal, so that Africa would belong to Portugal. So then Columbus goes over. Oh, I'm losing my place here. So when Spain goes across the Atlantic and discovers the Indies, which is what they called the islands in the Caribbean, the Pope had to redraw. Here's Columbus. I'm so busy talking, I'm not changing my slides. Ferdinand and Isabella had wisely bought a Spanish pope. So he redrew the line from horizontal to vertical. So the Treaty of Alcázar, which had that horizontal line of demarcation, became the famous Treaty of Tordesillas with the vertical line that divided the world vertically. And as we'll see, where that line ended up on the other side of the world remained a question for a long time. So he redrew the line so that the stuff that Columbus discovered across the Atlantic belonged to Spain, not to Portugal. So anyway, basically you have a situation where Spain can't go around Africa. They're looking at the Atlantic. They decided to take a small bet on this crazy Genovese guy who keeps coming to court and asking if he can sail out west across the Atlantic in their name, and they said, sure. And then he finds stuff, and then they find it was actually in Portugal's half, so they have to redraw the line, and here you go. So now you know why Spain. And that was the quick version, the elevator speech. So now that we know why Spain, let's talk about the most important thing about what happened next. Columbus's voyage not only changed the political balance of the world, he unwittingly kicked off the most significant biological event since humans came on the scene. As everybody's fifth grader knows, all the continents were once joined together in an ancient supercontinent called Pangaea. Remember how they cut it apart and they say, oh my gosh, look at that, it works, you know? And then when all the continents drifted apart into the continents that we know today, all the species that had evolved on those land masses evolved separately over many eons. When Columbus's ships arrived, you can see the little red rectangle there. Suddenly, plants, animals, insects, humans, and importantly, microbes that had long been isolated from each other were suddenly thrown together in what the historian Alfred W. Crosby called the re-knitting together of Pangaea. He called it the Columbian Exchange, and I'll bet you students have heard of it. I'll bet that's something you learn now, but that's yeah. It's really an important concept because it caused irreversible changes in the New World. And if you're interested in knowing what the Americas were like before and after the Columbian Exchange was set in motion, you can read Charles Mann's books. They're not real recent, but they're still fabulous and correct, 1491 and 1493. So the Columbian Exchange, of course, had devastating consequences for America's native people. And you can see all these plants, animals, microbes that got thrown together. I mean, without the Columbian Exchange, we wouldn't have had chocolate or tomatoes or pasta sauce or a lot of the germs that now are thrown around. And it did cause devastation among America's indigenous populations. Up to 90% of America's indigenous people died as a result of diseases to which they had no natural resistance. And of course, the Columbian Exchange came to California with the California missions. It changed the ecosystems that California's native people had existed on for millennia. And all these things that now make California an agricultural powerhouse are non-native species. Well, I mean, I'm kind of glad they brought the wine grapes, but California's landscape and America's landscape was changed forever. In fact, some of those species went in advance of the Europeans. When the Spaniards first came to the Southeast, they brought peaches with them, peach trees. Peach trees made it out to the Southwest before the Spaniards did. So now how do we get from Columbus to missions in California? It took a long time, more than 250 years, in fact, because California was really, really remote. So we think of it as kind of being the center of the world, but it was really far away. It was during most of the Spanish Empire's 300 plus year history in North America, This California we now think of as being the center of the world was more remote from Europe than Siberia. Once the early conquistadors had rampaged through the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Gulf Coast, and Central America, they figured they were on a new continent, but this was not part of their plan. They still wanted to get to China and the Spice Islands. And suddenly they stood on the edge of this. It's the world's largest body of water, of course, comprising 30% of the Earth's surface. And they didn't know that, but they knew it was a daunting barrier. Now, as you know, Magellan set out to conquer that barrier. He departed Spain in 1519, and 3 years later, after a terrifying voyage, only one of his 4 ships made it back to Spain, commanded by Sebastián Elcano. Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines. They did prove that you could cross the Pacific by sailing west. Now, after Magellan, Spain, remember, Portugal has gone around Africa. They've crossed the Indian Ocean, and they are trading like mad in the Indies. They're in the Moluccas. They're getting all the spices, all the good stuff. And Spain is still staring at the Pacific, going, my God, we can't compete. So the king kept saying, try again. And these are some of the voyages that went out across the Pacific in the early 1500s. I won't go over all of them, but we'll just look at that last one. By the way, they wanted to get to the Philippines because they knew it was just a perfect gateway for Asian trade. It was close to China, and it had a lot of resources where you could get water and food, and they just wanted to try to set up a trading base in the Philippines, which were not named yet, but which Magellan had found. So all these expeditions are crossing the Pacific. Villalobos in 1542 did finally claim the Philippines and name them after Philip II, who at the time was a prince. His father was the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. But he was captured and expired, it was said, of a broken heart in a Portuguese prison in the Moluccas. The other Pacific expedition in 1542 was somebody I'll bet you've heard of. It was commanded by Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo. He was ordered to sail not west, but north to chart the California coast and find suitable ports. He was probably looking for the Northwest Passage, too, because they still thought it was up there somewhere. So Cabrillo, and by the way, I bet some of you have been on the replica of his ship, the San Salvador. It comes to Santa Barbara. It lives in San Diego. It's a great replica. It's very correct. So Cabrillo discovered San Diego, the Channel Islands, the Santa Barbara Channel, Monterey. He probably went up north, maybe as far as Point Reyes, but then before he headed home. On the way home, however, it was on Christmas, he splintered his leg during a skirmish with natives on one of the Channel Islands. It's thought to be San Miguel Island. And he died when his wound turned gangrenous. We're not sure where he's buried, but it's thought that it's San Miguel Island. And of course, Catalina says, no, it was here. But the more important thing about Cabrillo's voyage is that he didn't find anything of interest to the king or the viceroy, i.e., no gold or silver or advanced civilizations like the wildly rich civilization that the Aztecs had down in their Mexican capital at Tenochtitlan. Then as now, there's Tenochtitlan, pyramids, gold, silver up the wazoo. And what's happening in California? Just like now, living their best life ever on the beach. And in fact, the people who went north later said they wanted to party so much it was hard to get away from them anyway. If you look at their journals, it's really cute. But so because of that, and because of the contrary winds and currents, as any sailor knows, that come down the California coast. And so in those days, before cure for scurvy, you were sailing north and half your sailors would die of scurvy before you ever got to where you thought you were going. So California just didn't seem worth the effort and expense. So the native people in California were spared the entire conquistador era. And at the end, I'll tell you something interesting about the laws that ended it. For context, while all this Pacific exploration was going on, the Coronado expedition was wandering around the Southwest, making life utterly miserable for the Puebloans, looking for Cibola. And Hernan de Soto was terrorizing the Mississippian cultures of the entire Southeast. Both men joined the long list of failed conquistadors. Coronado went home broke to face charges for abusing the Indians, and De Soto died of a fever on the banks of the Mississippi River. About 20 years later, in 1564, The new king, Charles V's son, Philip, for whom the Philippines had been named, ordered the viceroy to get that darn trading base in the Indies set up once and for all. But as Magellan and others had found, you could sail west across the Pacific, as favorable winds and currents were with you, but getting back home was a lot harder. The puzzle was finally solved by a Basque friar mariner and an Afro-Portuguese pilot. This Basque navigator, Andrés de Urdaneta, had been one of only 24 survivors on one of those earlier expeditions. He was imprisoned by the Portuguese in the Moluccas for 8 years, but he didn't waste his time. He kind of learned the Malay language, kept his ear to the ground, and chatted it up with all the Malay navigators and found out a lot about Pacific winds and currents. 8 years later, he finally made it back to Spain as a prisoner on a Portuguese ship. Then he gave up seafaring, he thought. He just decided, that's enough, enough is enough, I'm tired of sailing, and he became a monk. Seemed like a good idea at the time. But then, a while later, in September of 1564, King Felipe II, who we just mentioned was keen to get that trading base set up in the Pacific, ordered the aging Friar Mariner, now almost 60, out of retirement to lead a new expedition across the Pacific. Urdaneta reluctantly agreed, but only as head pilot, he said. He insisted that his friend Miguel Lopez de Legazpi would be given command of the expedition. Their 5 ships were built in secret in the backwater port of Navidad, Mexico, a really crummy place to build ships, because he didn't want the Portuguese spies to find out what they were up to. Like, why are they building those 5 really big ocean-going ships? While the ships were being built, Urdaneta undoubtedly discussed his thoughts about the return route with all of the fleet's pilots. So, they embarked in September 1564, and in May 1565, they reached the Philippines. While Legazpi was setting up the new colony, Urdaneta explored around the archipelago and found, voila, Chinese junks came there every year to trade with the locals. Well, foreign ships were not allowed into Chinese ports, so there was the opening to China trade. Now, all they had to do was get back across the vast Pacific with its contrary winds and currents. Urdaneta is famous for figuring out the return route, also called La Vuelta or El Tornaviaje, from Manila back to Acapulco. Ships would first have to sail counterintuitively north up the coast of Japan, then across the northern Pacific and down the western coast of North America. There's a thing called the North Pacific Gyre, and that's what they were following, okay? He arrived, anyway, that's what they would have to do. So Urdaneta departed the Philippines on June 1st, 1565, 1st of June. Unbeknownst to him, a month earlier, Lope Martin, the pilot of the smallest ship, which had become separated from the fleet on the way over. They told him to go ahead and see if there were any pirates out there, whatever, but somehow he got separated from the fleet in a storm. Never found them. But he did make it to the Philippines, and he couldn't find the rest of them at the various rendezvous points. So, getting low on supplies, he went ahead and threaded his way through the archipelago and headed out into the Pacific. He arrived in Mexico on August 9th, before Urdaneta, who arrived on October 8th. But the Augustinian friars had a much better PR machine than Afro-Portuguese pilots. So until this recent book by Professor Andrés Reséndez, who gave a talk at the Maritime Museum last year, Lope Martin was sort of written out of the story, and it's still called Urdaneta's Route. Now, although they did not travel on the Kelp Highway because big ships would not want to be that close to the coastline. They would dread being too close to the rocky coastlines. But both navigators nonetheless followed the same pattern of winds and currents as California's first arrivals thousands of years earlier. Their achievement launched the Manila Galleon trade, which was the real beginning of globalization. Pacific trade and globalization is big thing these days. It started with the Manila Galleons, and it was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire and the reason Spain needed ports on the California coast, which led to the founding of California's presidios and missions. Those treasure-laden ships crossing an ocean where there were probably a lot of pirates from France and England and Holland wandering around, They needed ports after the 12,000-mile crossing. They needed safe places to shelter. So next time you see a piece of blue and white china at the Mission or Presidio Museum, you might think of the Manila Galleons and the beginning of globalization. And by the way, here's something that is surprising. For 200 years, all the early explorers and the Manila Galleon captains totally missed one of the world's greatest natural harbors. Well, if you've ever looked at San Francisco at the Golden Gate from the sea, imagine if the bridge wasn't there. If you look through that opening, what do you see on the other side? You see Alcatraz and the Oakland Hills. And if you're staying a little bit offshore to keep off the rocks, you're going to think it's just a continuous coastline. It was discovered by Portola's land party by mistake when they were looking for Monterey. Anyway, so at long last, missions and presidios in Alta California. So the China trade's underway, the galleons need ports after that long Pacific crossing, but why on earth did it take Spain so long to get the California project going? It's in the book. It took me a long time to summarize it, but the elevator speech is that due to nearly 200 years of war in Europe, money woes, regime change, endless bureaucratic delays, and political skullduggery that torpedoed a royal order to settle Monterey in 1606, California's native people got that 150-year reprieve from colonial invaders. So good for them. Now, at long last, defensive considerations forced Spain to come up with a plan to settle those long claim ports in Alta California. Remember, Cabrillo had found them and claimed them. It's funny how they just, if they found something, and if they were just Indians living there, they'd say, oh, that's ours. They plant the flag. You know, we have a flag. It's ours. That was the way they did it, you know. Anyway, Russian fur traders were moving down the coast. The hated English were still prowling around the Pacific, and the galleons still needed ports after that long crossing. So it was no ordinary bureaucrat that finally got that plan into motion. The fellow on the right there, Jose de Galvez, I think he's one of the most interesting characters from the mission era. He was New Spain's visitador, or inspector general, and he stepped in. He was one of the most interesting figures, as I said, of that time. He was a brilliant lawyer trained at the University of Salamanca. He was an Enlightenment era intellectual, seriously bipolar, by the way, did some crazy things. And he was an 18th century practitioner of realpolitik, kind of like an early Henry Kissinger. He envisioned an open and democratic society in Alta California with lots of tax-paying citizens. He was in charge of helping to refill the royal coffers, which were pretty empty. I mean, the whole colonial project was a real money suck for the Spaniards. They went broke like 9 times, you know, in the 17th century. And he deeply disagreed, actually, with the Franciscans' rigid beliefs and medieval practice of gathering all the Indians into mission communities instead of having them live in the pueblos with everybody else. But still, he had no choice because the Jesuits had just been expelled from the New World, so the Franciscan missionaries were what he had to work with. And why would he have to use missionaries at all? Because Spain just couldn't muster enough settlers for what was then still a very remote territory. The realistic Galvez just needed to make Spanish citizens and a labor force of the Indian population. That had been their MO in the New World. So the Franciscans were on duty. Galvez appointed Don Gaspar de Portola, who doesn't have any painted portraits that we could find, who had sensitively handled the expulsion of the Jesuits. And he was the appointed military leader of a sacred expedition. By the way, all of Spain's expeditions were sacred expeditions. And Junipero Serra, who had just successfully established 5 missions in the very rugged and hostile Sierra Gorda region of Mexico, he was appointed to be the Father Presidente of the new mission chain. And together they carried out Galvez's orders to implement what was Spain's final imperial project. We are the tail end of Spain's empire, the last gasp. There they are. The first mission, of course, was at San Diego in 1769. And then in 1770, here's a painting of the founding of Monterey. Note that mission is a makeshift ramada. They put up a cloth over some trees. Now, this is what Mission San Carlos Borromeo looks like today. Father Serra never saw the beautiful stone church at Carmel. This is what the missions looked like for their first decades. They were just little groups of simple huts. And that's what the San Francisco Presidio looked like even in 1826. These were just small. I mean, when you think that these were supposed to defend California from the Russians and the English and everybody, you think, what? Because there were only, maybe at every mission, just a handful of priests at most. In every Presidio, there were maybe 100 soldiers at most, more like a few dozen. So this was a pretty lightweight occupation. And this is 1823 map showing the locations of all the missions, and as they were organized into 4 Presidio districts, which is how I organized the itineraries in my book, so that you don't have to do this and try to see them in canonical order. So now here's something fun that I have to stick in. I don't have time for the whole story because I don't want to have you people here too long, but I do want to make a fun connection with Santa Barbara. Juan Bautista de Anza, who was captain at the time of Tubac Presidio, and he was one of the great explorers of the American West. Bolton was all over him. I mean, he just loved Anza and wrote very in glowing terms of his accomplishments. And he was quite an amazing guy. And he was eventually governor of New Mexico. But anyway, because he was such a capable guy, Galvez told him to establish a supply route to supply the California missions. Because remember the part about how hard it was to get ships to sail north? You'd die of scurvy before you ever got up there to resupply Monterey. So he said, now make us a supply route from Sonora to Monterey, which Anza did. So he went and established the route, and then he was promoted and told to go back and take a group of 240 settlers up to Monterey. Well, and then he went on to establish the site for the San Francisco Presidio, and on the way home, he sighted Mission Santa Clara and the San Jose Pueblo. Well, his expeditions have been reenacted in great detail because of the diaries that survive, which you can see online. There's a website called Web Anza that has everything. So what happens is that Santa Barbara's very own V. and George Oburn, whose daughter is here tonight, are shown with the bicentennial Anza ride in 1976. And I've got to say that we're talking about local people who do a lot to preserve history. V was an absolute dynamo. She contributed so much to Santa Barbara. I think she single-handedly saved her whole war and showgrounds. And she and George helped found the Santa Barbara Trails Council, and the bike trail from Hope Ranch to Goleta Beach is named for them. That's the ribbon cutting. And that's the historic home in Hope Ranch where V's daughter Dale and her family still live. So anyway, but when I thought about the Anza ride, I think of V and George participating in the reenactment of that long ride. So and that was in 1776, by the way. So we are getting to some really familiar sounding dates. Let's ask one more question. What was going on back east during the mission era? Quite a lot, turns out. I mean, what was happening? There, the Padres and the soldiers are setting up the various missions and presidios. What on earth was happening elsewhere in the world? Here are some dates you can just compare. So when I looked into it, my question was, what was Spain's reaction to the American Revolution? I mean, Spain is a monarchy, and the Americans were revolting against a monarch. Well, it turns out that Spain and France were allied in something called the Bourbon Compact. It was like a family alliance. And ever since the days of the Spanish Armada and the days when Philip of Spain tried to depose Queen Elizabeth I of England, who was actually his sister-in-law because she was a heretic and a Protestant, and he sent the Armada to try and get her off the throne and put a Catholic on instead. And so ever since those days, the English and the Spanish just kind of had this real thing going. They just never really, it was like the Hatfields and the Coys. They never really gave up on that. And so when the American Revolution started, Galvez, who was now promoted to Viceroy of New Spain, got his nephew involved. This man has been called America's Spanish savior, and he's only one of 8 foreigners ever to be made an honorary U.S. citizen. I think that didn't happen until Obama's presidency. But as the American Revolution began, here's why. Jose de Galvez, now Viceroy of New Spain, wanted the British out of the Mississippi Valley because he feared their incursions into Spanish territory. The Spanish territory is that orange area on the left. The British territory is sort of the buff stuff, and the yellow are the rebelling colonies. And Spain wanted Florida back. During the 7 Years' War, which was called the French and Indian War in the Americas, Spain lost her Florida colony to the British, and they wanted it back. So Jose put his talented nephew, Bernardo, on the job. Bernardo was now a general and the governor of Spanish Louisiana. In spite of losing many of his ships in a hurricane, they just would never learn that September was hurricane season. I don't know why. They just kept sailing in hurricane season. Bernardo drove the British from Florida in the siege of Pensacola, from their forts on the Gulf Coast and in the Mississippi River Valley. Then Washington only had to fight on one front, and the British lost their Mississippi River supply lines. Bernardo Galvez was all over this. He also helped the American rebels with spying, covert ops, arms shipments, and by channeling cash to them via money laundering with funds raised in part by taxing the California and Sonora presidios. So you helped pay for the revolution out here. So, and just as vital to the cause was this man. Did I go past him? Oh, I added a picture of him. Nice. The Spanish finance minister, Don Francisco Saavedra. That's a statue of him in New Orleans. Oh, sorry, that was Galvez. I must have stuck that in last minute. Here's Saavedra. He was the Spanish finance minister. He was a brilliant diplomat, a military man, and known as the ultimate fixer. France and Spain, as I said, were allied in the Bourbon Compact. He wanted to make sure that they would win over the English, their common enemy. And so that led them to support George Washington, and Saavedra was all over it. So in 1781, hearing that the French fleet was stuck in Haiti and the French infantry was stuck up in Newport, Rhode Island, both due to lack of funds, Saavedra sprang into action. He raised 500,000 silver pesos in just a few days by floating a bond with wealthy Spaniards down in Cuba. This paid to send the 36 ships of the line of Admiral Comte de Grasse from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake. That money also enabled General Rochambeau to march his ground troops from Newport to Yorktown along with Washington's forces. Without Saavedra's help in raising that money, de Grasse, the Comte de Grasse, was going to take his ships and go back to France. And Rochambeau, God knows what he was going to do. Maybe our admiral historian might even know. But they sure weren't going to go to Yorktown. So without Saavedra's help and the funds that he raised, that pivotal battle at Yorktown, and in fact, the revolution itself might well have been lost. At that point, George Washington despaired of ever winning that war. They were really down. Now, there's a great book that describes this. It's Nathaniel Philbrick's In the Hurricane's Eye. So, ironically, France would soon be convulsed by revolution itself, and Spain would soon lose her fading empire. Napoleon would become the catalyst for the Mexican independence and the ejection of all Spanish from New Spain, including the Spanish priests of the missions. In 1833, the cash-strapped government of newly independent Mexico secularized all the missions and sold their long-coveted properties to prominent Mexicans with cash and connections. And that was the end of the mission era. Most of the missions ultimately fell into ruin, except, of course, for Mission Santa Barbara, which in true Santa Barbara fashion was saved by some local donors. And that is why the Mission Archive Library is here, because the mission never fell into ruin, and it was always under the care of the Franciscans. Today, of course, all the missions have been rebuilt and restored, but that's another story. Now, and I added this, especially for the students. To wrap it up, let's talk about some debates about human rights that took place in Spain in the 1500s. This is a pretty little-known historical episode. I'm glad to see it's now taught in AP European history. I wonder if it's taught in AP American history. Has anyone heard of the Valladolid debates? I know I'm going to have a lot of hands go up over here, right? Let's spell it for you. You kids heard of this? Oh, yay. Well, you can look at it. I'll give you some books. In one of those historical ironies, In the early 1500s, as conquistadors were still rampaging through the Americas, intellectuals in Spain were intensely deliberating the morality of conquest and human rights, including the rights of indigenous people, and the legitimacy of colonization itself. This is nearly 200 years before the official start of the Age of Enlightenment. The most famous protagonist in this story is conquistador turned Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, probably the most effective lobbyist and social activist in history. He was a participant on Columbus's second voyage and witnessed firsthand the shocking atrocities perpetrated on native peoples on Hispaniola by out-of-control conquistadors. He later published a tract called, I wish I could say it in Spanish, Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies. Of course, this was eagerly seized upon by Europe's Protestants as proof of Spanish barbarity, like I told you, giving rise to the Black Legend, which you've probably also heard of. Another irony, of course, the Protestant sects of the 1600s could be pretty barbaric toward each other. I think burning people counts in that category. So Las Casas' conversion from conquistador to priest began on Hispaniola in 1511. He was in the congregation when this guy, Fray Antonio de Montesino, thundered from the pulpit, castigating the colonists for their abuse of the natives, declaring it a sin against God and man. Las Casas was so moved. He was an encomendero at the time. He had a estate, Indian workers. He gave up his estates, freed his Indian workers, and took holy orders. Under pressure back in Spain from Montesino and others, King Ferdinand issued the 1512 Laws of Burgos, declaring Indians to be fully human. This was a big deal then. When people made it to the Americas, they were people who were running around naked and acting very different to Europeans. I'm sure the Indians thought the same thing about the Spaniards when they arrived. They were smelly and covered in metal. So, we were talking about very different peoples encountering each other. But the Laws of Burgos forbade, at least in principle, any abuse of the Indians and set out in law their right to their persons and properties. It was a step in the right direction, but the laws were weak and ineffective. Then, the same issue continued to haunt Spain's national conscience. In 1538, a series of lectures at the famous University of Salamanca, led by the great humanist, scholar, and priest, a Dominican priest, Francisco de Vitoria, laid out the foundation for a code of international laws, one of the first times that was mentioned, based on the idea that all peoples, including indigenous peoples in the New World, are of one family and entitled to ethical government. Concept. As a result, the new Laws of Burgos were issued in 1542 that strictly prohibited mistreatment or enslavement of native people and seizure of their property. Again, sounds good in theory, but it's really hard to enforce laws from far away. When the Viceroy of Peru tried to enforce them, he was assassinated. Anyway, over time, many conquistadors were prosecuted. Many went home in chains, and arrested for breaking those laws. And over time, the laws were enforced. So Las Casas, and by the way, his relentless lobbying caused yet another great debate to occur at the Colegio de San Gregorio in Valladolid in 1550 and 1551, because Las Casas kept saying those laws you have, they're not being enforced and the Indians are still being abused. And so the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V suspended all activity in the New World and brought this debate at the Colegio in Valladolid. And so Las Casas took one side. He took the side of the Indians. He was known as the defender of the Indians. And Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda took the other side and took the Aristotelian view that because they were so primitive and because they practiced things like slavery and cannibalism, the Indians were natural slaves. The judges of the debate never really came to a conclusion, but the Pope and the King agreed with Las Casas, and they were the ones who insisted that the laws finally be enforced. So as a result, the laws were signed, and sadly, though, there was one really bad outcome of all that, and that was that they started importing slaves from Africa because they were no longer allowed to enslave Indians. And so slavery was not really prohibited in the Spanish colonies until 1817. But anyway, so you can go look that up. Those were really interesting philosophical debates that took place in a place where you would not expect it. And so at the time, by the time Spain settled the last colony here in California, the laws had long been enforced, in contrast to the much earlier settlement of New Mexico, which I'm researching now, where abuses led to the famous 1680 Pueblo Revolt. That was the only revolt in the Americas where the Spanish were thrown out for a period of time. They were thrown out for 12 years. But then the Indians started fighting amongst themselves, and the Spanish came back, and then anyway. But that Pueblo Revolt was very famous. So I'd like to close. Here's the Valladolid debates, Las Casas, and there's Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. I'd like to close with another story, another indigenous perspective that surprised Ed and me this past year. We were visiting Acoma Pueblo, which was the site of some of the most violent and brutal confrontations between Puebloans and Spaniards during the conquest of New Mexico. We had an Acoma guide, and I was actually kind of afraid to visit Acoma because I'd read about the awful things that happened there. I mean, the conquistador, what they did to the Indians when they would fight back was just brutal and horrible. And I thought, I'll bet they're still pretty grumpy about it. I bet they still really don't, they don't want us to come and visit. I felt embarrassed to visit there. So our guide, whose name was Turtle, he said, because his grandmother told him if they waited for him to bring the wood in for the fire, they'd all freeze to death. Anyway, took us to see this big church on the left there, and proudly explained that his ancestors had built that huge church of San Esteban del Rey with their own hands. All the books say that the church was built with slave labor, with forced labor. And I asked him about that, and he said, today, we love our church. That's where we go to Mass. And he invited us to come back at Christmas and said they had this beautiful service at Christmas. And then he told us what his grandmother had advised. She said, you can't change history. We just have to do better going forward. So I thought that was pretty good. I've had some advice from two very smart people lately. So to lighten up a bit, I'll just say that Whining and Dining Through History in California is pretty fun. That's why it's the subtitle of my book. And my anthropologist friends tell me that humans have been solving problems over food and wine for thousands of years. And I just thought I'd share with you this caveman advice for wine pairing. What is it? Let's see. Is it Stone Age wine pairing? If it tries to eat us, serve with red. If it runs away, serve with white. Okay. Anyway, so now, let me ask you a question. Dacia, would you like me? I have about a 5-minute series of slides that show all the missions. Would you like me to run through that so you can see if you've missed anything lately, or you want me just to go straight to the Q&A? Okay, let's look at the missions. I've talked an awful lot about philosophy and stuff. Okay. By the way, Ed and I do this in our Airstream. So, all right. The missions are grouped by Presidio districts, and I'm going to go south to north. And I'm going to go pretty fast. I'm not going to talk much. I'm just going to show you that they're all really different, and they're all beautiful, and they've all been restored. And you should just go see them all. This little Asistencia near San Diego is wonderful. And this one, the San Antonio de Paula, is one of my very favorites. That's the beautiful painted interior. It's out. And of course, San Luis Rey de Francia is the biggest mission. And it's the only one with a dome. And of course, this is the one that got knocked down by the earthquake. But San Juan Capistrano has gorgeous gardens. But you should take binoculars when you go, because some remnants of the painted decorations still remain. And it has the oldest adobe building in California. San Gabriel Archangel looks like different, because its padre was from Cordoba, and the Cathedral of Cordoba was formerly a mosque, and he remembered what it looked like, and it does look very much like the Cathedral of Cordoba. Next is the Santa Barbara Presidio district, and surprisingly, one of them, and by the way, that was just a district that could be protected by one Presidio. San Fernando Rey de España is in the Santa Barbara Presidio district with its famous long building. And it, like most of the missions, has a gorgeous garden. Then there's San Buenaventura, overlooking the ocean, with its beautiful garden. And of course, the only surviving presidio in California is Santa Barbara's. All the others are just dirt. So it's pretty special. And of course, we have the Queen of the Missions, where the Mission Archive Library is, where that book sits with the design that was used for the facade of the Santa Barbara Mission. And some really rare Chumash art is at the Santa Barbara Mission. These statues used to be on the pediment but fell down in the earthquake and are now in the museum. Then, of course, you have the Mission of the Valley, Santa Ynez. Very beautiful. And it has one of the most rare pieces of art in the whole mission system. And I don't know why it's up over the door, but that's where it is. And that's the Archangel Gabriel. Or is it Raphael? Sorry, Archangel Raphael. And then the Mission La Purísima has been completely rebuilt by the CCC, and it's within a state park, has miles of beautiful trails, hello patches. No. And then the Monterey Presidio District, of course, was the biggest because Monterey was the capital of Alta California. It starts with San Luis Obispo de Tolosa, the first use of mission tile in California. And there's a hidden mission near San Luis Obispo that I discovered on a sage hens ride. They said, "You want to see the Asistencia?" I said, "Sure." Well, nobody could find this lost mission for years, and then they discovered it was inside this barn. You see the stone walls with the arches? That was a big assistant mission, big agricultural operation. And then one of my favorites is Mission San Miguel. It's so plain and austere from the exterior, but inside the paintings just covered. It looks like the frescoes of Piero della Francesca. It's just beautiful colors. And then, of course, there's the one I love because it's the cover of my book, San Antonio de Padua out on Camp Hunter Liggett. You can stay there now. You can stay at the Hearst Hacienda, which is nearby, or you can stay at the mission, and it's really fun. It's just beautiful. It's the only, it's just a special place. And then there's little lonely Soledad, but that's near the River Road Wine Trail, in case you're interested. But this is what happens when you take, when the missions were abandoned and the tile roofs were removed, all those mud walls just turned to mud again. And there's San Carlos Borromeo, one of the few stone buildings in California, those days with its famous catenary ceiling. A catenary arch is when you take a chain and you lift it up, and it's a natural arch that it makes. Ed knows that, right? And of course, the Royal Presidio Chapel in Monterey is often mistaken for mission. And if you want something cool, go up there for their annual Christmas in the Adobes tour, really. And then Little Mission Santa Cruz had nothing left, but they did a 1/3 size Disneyland replica. They do have the only surviving building that was neophyte, that's Mission Indian housing, that's left. Finally, San Francisco has a Presidio district, and I divided it into south and north in my itinerary, so you didn't have to try to do that whole thing in one day with all the traffic. There's San Juan Bautista is great. It's got a whole historic district with historic buildings. It's one of the biggest mission churches, and it's the only one with 3 aisles. Then there's Mission Santa Clara, which has been rebuilt 6 times. This is the 6th one. Mission San Jose is supposed to be the most authentically restored mission. I took that picture at Christmas because I just love what they do. And then finally, the end of the mission trail up in north of San Francisco. By the way, amazingly, as we all know about the San Francisco earthquake, Little Mission Dolores was the only mission era building that survived that earthquake. Its walls are about 6 feet thick, and the mission isn't very tall. So I guess that helped it, but it's still there. You can see the big cathedral next to it. It was pretty damaged. And inside the Mission San Francisco de Asís are these beautiful Olone motifs, paintings. And then, of course, there's a mission that is no more. There was a big assistant mission for Mission Dolores down on the peninsula. That's gone. But if you want to see the roof tiles, you can go to the train station in Burlingame. And by the way, there's no San Francisco Presidio anymore because, of course, overlooking the Golden Gate's a pretty strategic location. So a lot of other things were put there, including by the Americans, of course. And but that's what the Presidio looked like back in 1826. Now there's Fort Point is down there, and there's a really neat museum at Fort Point. So I'd suggest you. Then up in Marin County, there's Mission San Rafael with its little Moorish window. Remember, there's a lot of Moorish influence in mission architecture. And I don't know what that pink thing is, but oh my goodness. And then there's the very last one. It was the only mission that was built during the Mexican era, San Francisco to Solano up in Sonoma, near the Sonoma Plaza. So that's the end of your mission trail. Vaya con Dios. Now, I'm sure you all want to go finish your glass of wine, but let me just say that my email address is on the screen. If anybody wants to try to remember a book that I mentioned or has a question about anything, I'm very happy to correspond with you by email or take any questions now. So thank you very much.